Welcome to Explorations. Today we'll be talking with Christopher Stapleton, who is an experienced architect and producer and CEO of Simiosys Real World Labs and co-founder of the Virtual World Society. In this second of a five-part interview, Christopher discusses how the development of language became a disruptive technology and delves into the distinctions between the written word and oral language, seeing story as a construct that can advance humanity's evolution. He goes on to explore the need to invest in the arts and humanities because thinking through this lens is instrumental in taking the inventions from the scientific and engineering fields into innovations that benefit humanity. We were talking the other day about language, and you said that the development of language for Homo sapiens was a disruptive technology. I've referred to it actually in my new book as the first neuro revolution. Was the oral language. Say a little more about that and how you see that and how important that is to our understanding of story.
Well, first of all, there's the written language, and then there's the speaking language. Two different things. Speaking language is natural. Written language has been invented, and then they both have evolved through innovation of humankind. But we really understand that it is a technology, much like any other technology. Language is a construct that really works with us, that advances our humanity. Even though our brains don't evolve much more, that's a really slow process, but our humanity is evolving faster and faster, equal to technology, and in step with technology, keeping up with it. And so this is the opportunity that I love to do with media and story, is that story transcends media, but every storytelling depends upon the media. And so there's this unique relationship that story is beyond the words. A story is beyond the language. And in fact, language was probably invented so that we can share stories. And we share stories for this common human social engagement, this human connection. And most of all, it's to transcend time and space. Because someone was staying home and someone was going out and hunting, game or looking for vegetables to come back for the dinner around the fire that we're going to tell that story with paintings on the cave. And we had different stories. Are we going to keep them to ourselves? No, we want to connect with the others and share that. And so this aspect of language, just to kind of share that memory with someone else's memory, then you paint with each other's memories and you start to share these stories. And we had to evolve language so we can do that more effectively, and so effectively that the written language is able to transcend time and space, so that we are building upon every society and civilization from thousands of years to get where we are. And we're exponentially getting faster and better and evolving this humanity, as you can see, with technology. And so whenever I see a lot of STEM research and investment in STEM without the investment of humanities, design, media, and art, it doesn't understand innovation. Because STEM is involved with invention. Arts and humanities is all about innovation. It's how we adopt that new invention to transform our lives and change the way of living. And so that's where I've gotten into what I call transdisciplinary collaboration that is going to help us increase that innovation cycle to keep up with technology.
There's a notion that many storytellers talk about, is that story is a co-creative process. It's not just the teller who's creating the story, is that the teller and the listener are creating it together. And the story lives in the space. If we talk about story space, it lives in the space between us. And it lives in your mind and it lives in my mind. And together we are creating the story together, especially in oral storytelling, because the teller and the audience they're responding to each other. And,
Right.
in a very profound way, I don't know if you've ever been to the National Storytelling Festival, but there's tents set up all over Jonesboro, Tennessee, and a train track goes right through town. And one of the tents, it's called the railroad tent because the train is right behind the tent. And you can hear the train coming, and the teller's in the middle of the story. And the best tellers find a way to weave that train into their story. It becomes part of the story. It's reality intrudes into the story and it gets co-opted. Um,
That's
so
reminds me of my apartment in Japan with right next to the railroad. But that was a spawning of many stories of
right,
living abroad.
yeah,
But yeah, the very important thing, that's what's gotten me into my latest area of research of story, which is I call conversational story creation. Because one of the things that I found out working with people with aphasia is that I went there to help people with aphasia because a colleague was struck with aphasia, which is a loss of language due to a stroke. And the loss of language, you don't realize how much we depend upon it. And I was so moved by that. And I also had a colleague who was a leading, researcher and therapist and pathologist and working with aphasia. And so I was able to bring these together to explore how I can use my art of story to help this communication or the loss of communication. And where I went into the aphasia center, which was called Aphasia House, directed by Janet Whiteside, is that people with aphasia, even though they lost their language, they didn't lose their intellect. They didn't lose their imagination. And most of all, they didn't lose their sense of story. And in fact, the one thing that they missed the most when they were struck with aphasia and the language, both written, spoken, was all scrambled up. The one thing they missed most is being lost in reading a story or a novel. And so one of the things that my colleagues at Simiosys did, and particularly Dana Mott, who's an experienced designer, we embedded ourselves into the Aphasia Center to really kind of listen and look and interact with these aphasia therapy sessions to really see how can we infuse ourselves to help this process going along. We're thinking that we're going to help heal, we're going to help, fix these people, et cetera, and all this other stuff. And what we found out is that people with aphasia taught us more about story than we thought we could learn. And that is that there is a whole sense of story beyond words. And that's where we needed to explore and develop and experiment. We have to develop this sense of story, not just in our head, because we already have story in our head, but it's that story that you talk about that's between us. Is that how do we make that happen? How do we share the same story world in our shared imagination in this social interaction to make that human connection? And this is what we did step by step, little bit at a little bit. And we discovered this thing that we call conversational story creation, which evolved into a process we call story troves, which is a box of artifacts that with story provocative props that paint pictures in your imagination. So instead of like a movie has a projection screen with a projection of light, these story provocative objects, like a set design I usually do, is that it paints that story in your head. It's not outside. And once it's inside your head, it's easier for people without language to express the story from within than it is to tell a story from outside of it. And then that sparks that curiosity that then provokes the inquiry of others of, well, what do you see? Oh, I saw. And this ignited a conversation. And so this evolved story trove was able to not only help bring people with aphasia out from their inhibitions for communicating and connecting, which they have been barred because speech is the number one prejudice in the world, and it was a wall. But it also, because we dealt with what we call fictional simulation. This is when this is what happens when you read a novel, where you only read 1/8 the story in the words, and 7/8 of the story is imagined in your head. And this is, from the point of view of Ernest Hemingway, not just me. And so this painting with imagination is what I call the imaginality. That's where it is. And then This is that conversation that takes that stories and they build that story together. And then that is a memorable shared story world that they take with them, which was remarkable. And it brought the therapist down to the level of the clients, and it brought the caregivers who were like the third party up to the same level, and everyone was at the same level of engagement. And so this sociality that you talk of, I call it sociality, but you also describe it as this interaction with story, is so natural and so pervasive and so fluid that once we're able to get them there, everyone was able to make that jump of the communication barriers between them and have a beautiful experience. And we started to video capture it. And when we looked at it without the audio, we couldn't tell who was the therapist, who was the person who was impaired with aphasia, who was the caregiver. They were all just having a great time together, which was so unusual. And we were thinking we were healing them, but we weren't. We were not doing nothing for aphasia. We were doing nothing for language. We weren't focusing on the disability. We were focusing on their abilities. And that ability is that aspect of being able to converse with story with each other and spark and share each other's imagination.
Well, there's two things I want to talk about with that. But one is I'm thinking about the transferability of focusing on what they can do well, which is to story things, and how that probably has a transferable kind of infectious quality about their ability then to tackle the difficulties of losing their ability to use language effectively. There's a story form in reminiscence called instrumental storytelling, which is using a story about the past to help us empower us in the present. And I'm just thinking that there's something about this process you're describing, which is freeing, it's playful, and it probably also infused them with a sense of enthusiasm about what's possible for themselves.
Exactly. And the key word here is play.
Yeah.
And as Plato said, that I can learn more from a man through an hour of play than a year of conversation.